All right, I'll go ahead and kick things off. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight to the Angular MN Meetup. We've got a full house here tonight. I appreciate everybody coming out. Do feel free to find a seat. We're all friends here. You can jump in anywhere. Going over some of the housekeeping things. Wi-Fi passwords up there. I'll not say it aloud, but you can all read it. Say that on YouTube. Go into our sponsors. If you think the Angular Meetup is a great meetup and that we do great things, it is only due to our sponsors that have really been with us all the way through our journey. First of those being STG. STG hires open source developers. If you're doing a Java development or JavaScript development or open source development in general, they're a good group of folks to be talking to. They do full-time consulting, full staff, full benefits. As far as consulting goes, a really great company to be in touch with. Yeah. So we definitely here at Angular MN have been working with SCG for quite a long time. They also put on great conferences like Open Source North. If you have a chance to attend any of those events, I encourage you to. Also, Virtual for the space where we've been hosted since our very beginning, and also paying for our meetup dues to allow us to be on meetup.com to meet all of you. So with that, we will cut into hiring or looking for work. Is anybody hiring or looking for work?
Yeah, my name's Jim Urban. Sophie, Ashley. So if anybody's looking for full-time positions, primarily looking for back-end Java developers, hired as full-time salary consultants. I'm also considering front-end as well. So if you're interested in looking this up, Glassdoor, website, LinkedIn.
So any questions on that? Just reach out to Jeff Urban at Solution Design Group. You can answer all your questions for you.
Town Central, I work in virtual, actually part of initiating Angular and Security.
Yep. Summer.
3 years. Virtual has been 6 years. Looking for full-time for a position. Work for as virtual days, not and training press. Virtual is good. Any person's life. So if you want to work on an Node.js Angular,
Rails.
right? Obviously, great. It will be Spring Boot, Kubernetes, or Docker. Your technology needs a place. If you want to solve a real healthcare problem, consistently doing 30% year-over-year. Not on the whole, just on the costs. There are very few alternatives. Or you can go work for
Boom. I'm Lexi Littleton. Virtual is a great company, great folks, and do a lot of great technology things. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I can answer any of those as well from my past experience, which was great. Going into that, so we have no more harm for work. All for presenters, of course, if you are interested in presenting here at Angular Men, reach out to myself, John Walker, or Doug. We're always willing to talk to you about that. As well as on the Meetup website, we have a message board to post talks there. That's also a great place to get in touch with us. So with that, I do know also Midwest.js is looking for volunteers to help out there. If you are interested in doing that, I know they were in the Angular Slack today, the Angular MN Slack. If you are not in there, get in touch with me. You can get invited to be on there. I believe the link is on our Twitter and our Meetup page. You do have to submit your email address, so we have a link back. But they're looking for volunteers. If you're interested in that, reach out to me. I'll put you in touch with them. With that, do we have any lightning talks? Anyone like to jump up and present forward? Again, lightning talks are just quick 5 to 10 minute presentations. It could be something cool that you're working on at work, or maybe a question you want to post to the group. We're always able to do those just before presenter. All right, with that, I will hand things over to Wiersma and talking about launching yourself into the Angular 2 and TypeScript space. Let's give a round of applause for Wiersma.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming out to learn a little bit about TypeScript and Angular. First off, I think we got to give a round of applause for those sponsors with the pizza and the great location. All right. So you guys are out here to learn about the cutting edge. Angular 2 is not even out. I thought it would be out by now. It's not out yet. They're doing release candidates right now, which mean beta, not release candidate, because they've been changing APIs like the router and forms along the way. Maybe not massive changes, but enough to make it a little painful if you were building a production app. I think we're getting close. They've now got the forms and the router out there, as we'll talk about. So I think now is a great time to really start learning about Angular 2 because they're going to be close to release. I don't think there are big changes coming. But again, I'm no expert. They pulled stuff out that I didn't know they were working on. So a little bit about me. I'm a software developer, leader, and manager. I work for the American Academy of Neurology. From the Minneapolis area, I've been developing software for over 15 years. Love working in a wide variety of different technologies over that time. And really enjoyed presenting to user groups and conferences along the way. I think it just helps you learn more. If you're somebody who's thinking about doing a presentation, I couldn't encourage you more to just take the plunge and do it. You can start out by doing like a lightning talk. It's a great way to start because it's a nice short amount of time. You don't have to make a super formal presentation. And then just dive in and pick a subject that you're passionate about. It doesn't even have to be something you're super expert on. It's just got to be something you want to learn more about. So you're going to learn a ton as you're putting together the presentation. So I really encourage folks to get into that. It's a lot of fun. You get to meet new people along the way. All right, so enough about that. What are we going to cover in this presentation tonight? First off, we're going to give a little introduction to TypeScript. TypeScript is the language that Angular 2, the framework itself, is built in. And it's basically their recommended way to build Angular 2 apps, although you don't have to use TypeScript. The experience and the design of the framework kind of assumes that you're using TypeScript. Again, you can use ES6, you can use ES5, but I think you'll have the best experience, especially right now, when you use TypeScript. We're going to talk about mapping concepts from Angular 1 to Angular 2. So if you don't know Angular 1, then you can just tune out this 5 minutes of the presentation where we're going to have like a Rosetta Stone that compares the two. But if you do know Angular 1, you may have heard that you might have a little harder time learning Angular 2 than the folks that are just starting with Angular 2 from scratch. And this Rosetta Stone I'm going to show will hopefully smooth that over a little bit, gives you a little translation between the two. I think Angular 2, there's a lot less concepts and terms and structure that you have to learn. So especially when you're coming at it from scratch, it's a little easier to pick up and understand. And I actually think that's exciting because it means that if you're working with new developers or other people in your team that haven't even used JavaScript or Angular before, it's going to be easier for them to jump in and be productive. Especially if they're from more of a back-end server-based technology like Java or C#, any of those. They'll have a little easier time. Then we're going to, once we talk about Angular 1, we map stuff over, then we're going to get into the different major concepts around Angular 2. So first off, we have... That's not going to touch. We'll talk about bootstrapping and module loading. It just means how to start up your Angular 2 app. How do you set it up and start it up? And then the module loading is something that the library is going to handle for us. We're not going to have to worry about it. Someday the browsers will finally implement this, and then we'll just have the browser. Is that better? services and routing, these are the three main concepts that are in an Angular 2 app. So if you understand these three things, you're like 90% of the way there to building your Angular 2. And then finally, we'll cover template syntax. So just like Angular 1, you can make templates using HTML and special little Angular tags. You can do that in Angular 2 as well. Syntax is almost exactly the same as Angular 1 with a couple of new caveats. So we're going to cover those so you know how to use those and read those. If you have any questions along the way, just pop up your hand and stop me. I'd be happy to do the best I can to answer the question or close the point. All right. With that, let's talk a bit about TypeScript. So TypeScript has its own website, of course. Turns out that it's a tool that lets you write JavaScript the way you really want to. So that's what they do. TypeScript is a typed superset of JavaScript that compiles down to plain JavaScript. What this means is, if you know TypeScript, if you know JavaScript, you know almost all of TypeScript. It just adds some things on top of JavaScript. You can use TypeScript with any browser, any host, any OS, and it happens to be open source. And yes, it was created and maintained by Microsoft, which is a bit of a shocker. But believe it or not, they in recent years, much to my surprise, have taken almost all of their developer frameworks and libraries and put them up on GitHub and have taken contributions from the outside. It's kind of an amazing transformation. So if you hadn't heard about that and start hearing about Microsoft, it's actually true. They actually have done that. Go out and look at it if you don't believe me. I had to do that. Angular 2 itself is implemented TypeScript. I think I mentioned that. Again, it doesn't mean you have to use TypeScript building your Angular 2 apps, but I believe that you will have the best experience if you use TypeScript. Okay, so if there's one thing you pick up from my presentation, at least this part of it, pick this up. JavaScript is valid TypeScript. So on the screen here, on the left-hand side, we have TypeScript code. And on the right-hand side, we have JavaScript code. And this is an actual tool that you can use on the TypeScript website. And you can paste in your JavaScript code on the TypeScript side on the left there, and it will transpile it or compile it into JavaScript on the right. And what I'm trying to demonstrate in this slide is just that they're both the same. We take a valid piece of JavaScript and you paste it in and run it through the TypeScript compiler, and you just get out the same thing because they are equal. So TypeScript adds things on top of the JavaScript language. So that's why valid JavaScript just pastes right in. It's handled just like any other piece of TypeScript code. So that's kind of nice. That means that if you have any JavaScript libraries, they're going to work great with TypeScript. You can either pass them right to the TypeScript compiler if you want, or you can use them just by yourself as regular JavaScript files. You don't have to change it. Now, TypeScript adds some additional syntax on top of what JavaScript provides. And the TypeScript authors, I think, have been kind of savvy in how they did this. They follow, as close as they possibly can, the ES6 spec. And also now the ES7 spec that they're working on. So it's kind of like being able to use ES6 and ES7 features right now today and transpile that down to ES5 and deploy it to any of the modern browsers, which is really kind of nice because it takes years for these browsers to get widely distributed enough to be able to rely on their features. But I know I want to take advantage of some of the things that ES6 and ES7 offer today, and TypeScript lets you do that. So on the left side of this slide, we have TypeScript code. And on the right-hand side, we have the resulting JavaScript code, which is exactly what the TypeScript compiler transpile spits out. And in full disclosure, I added a couple of line breaks to the code on the right, but that's it. Just to make it a little bit more balanced so you can compare it between the two. You'll see there's a concept of a class in the TypeScript code, and that's getting compiled down to a nice self-executing function on the JavaScript side. So it's probably how you would write this type of code if you were just writing ES5 by hand. It looked very familiar to me, and it doesn't, doesn't mangle your variable names or change anything like that, like some of the other transpilers out there do. So it's pretty readable. You get output that's pretty similar to your TypeScript code, and I think that's an advantage. It makes it easy to debug and see what's going on. That being said, you shouldn't really have to dive too much into the ES5 code that the TypeScript compiler produces. You won't really have to worry about it too much. So what are some features that we get by using TypeScript? We get things like classes, modules, interfaces, generics, arrow functions. All these kind of extra syntactical sugar or nice-to-haves that ES5 doesn't give us. Now, we don't have to use all of the features on this list here. If you're a shop that just doesn't do a lot of object-oriented programming, maybe you do a lot of functional style programming, you can still use TypeScript. You don't have to use classes at all. You can continue to do everything with functions, and everything will be great. Likewise, if you're not a big fan of interfaces and setting those up, you don't have to use those either. But it is a feature that TypeScript provides. And the TypeScript compiler will go out and it will check your types if you do classes or your interfaces if you use those. And it will let you know if you're doing something you're not supposed to do, which some people find beneficial. I find it very helpful, but others find extremely annoying. So just know that you don't have to use those features. You can ignore them. You don't have to use them. Instead of declaring an explicit type, we'll see in a second, you can use the any keyword to basically say it can be anything. You can have parts of your code that have classes and types in them, and other parts of your code that don't have any types whatsoever. So you can mix and match however you'd like so that you can get some of the benefits of the TypeScript. There's also something called type definitions that are part of TypeScript, and think of these as the map, if you will, the documentation of a third-party API, whether that's something you wrote or somebody else wrote. The type definition will tell the TypeScript compiler what classes and methods that JavaScript library, TypeScript library, exposes. And that way you can get nice code hitting right in your IDE about what methods are available, what arguments they take. And we'll show an example in a little bit of what one of those type definition files looks like so you can see how I think it's relatively easy to write. One of the things I love about TypeScript is that it really mirrors the ECMAScript 6 feature set. So if you know or been watching ES6, a lot of the syntax and the way the TypeScript works just mirrors what's in ES6. So perhaps down the road, you could take a TypeScript file when ES6 is more widely distributed, it's in the browsers, and just send it right down to the browser and have the browser executed as ECMAScript 6. So how do you get started if you want to use TypeScript? Pretty easy. You install it using npm. It's kind of nice to install it globally because then you have access to the compiler everywhere. And you can use the tsc command to compile TypeScript files down to, again, either ECMAScript 6 or ECMAScript 5. You can see there's a tsconfig.json file that's over on the left-hand side of the slide there. You're basically passing configuration to the compiler there. And this file gets generated for you automatically if you use the Angular 2 CLI environment, which I'm going to show later. So if that file doesn't make any sense to you and seems like a lot of work, don't worry. Somebody else is going to set that up for you. You don't have to worry about it. There's a tool called Typings that you also install from npm. And you can use that tool to download type definition files for you. Remember, those are the kind of the API definitions for third-party libraries. And some third-party libraries, like Angular 2, ship with their TypeScript definitions built into the npm package. So you don't have to worry about installing those. They get pulled in automatically for you. But if you had another library, like I use a library called Pusher to do WebSockets and send messages, display them in real time, I needed to pull down the type definition for that. Originally, I made my own, and then they made one, so I just grabbed it. So typing is a tool that can help you. It's very much like installing a package from NPM or Power. It's just you're installing a typing instead of the package itself. And they're all managed up on GitHub, so if you make a typing for a library that doesn't have one, you can contribute, and other folks can help. Okay, let's talk a bit about mapping concepts from Angular 1 to Angular 2. So, folks who didn't do any Angular 1, you get to take a break during this part of the presentation. And you can kind of smile or laugh softly about the weird terminology from Angular 1 folks. Okay, so on the left, Angular 1. On the right, Angular 2. So we have ECMAScript 5 is what most people who write Angular 1 use. Not that you couldn't build an Angular 1 app in TypeScript. In fact, I did a presentation on that about a year ago here. But most of the examples and most folks are using ECMAScript 5. Angular 2, on the other hand, they seem to encourage TypeScript right from the beginning. And you don't have to use it, but they kind of encourage it. That's where all the samples are shown right now. In Angular 1, you have controllers, but in Angular 2, you have components. So kind of a mapping between two things that start with C there. Let's see if I trip up there. In Angular 1, there were filters. And in Angular 2, the closest thing we have is pipes. They're pretty similar to filters. In Angular 1, you had that ng-app attribute that you'd stick, on your HTML tag at the top, or your body tag, or a div tag somewhere. In Angular 2, you don't have to put any attributes anywhere, but you do have to call this bootstrap function that we're going to show. And that functionally does the same thing that this old ng-app attribute used to do. Just kind of gets your app started. Shows Angular what parts of the page it needs to control. In Angular 1, we had the ng-class attribute. In Angular 2, we still have ng-class, but you can see it's spelled a little different. There's no dash, it has this camel case thing, and then these brackets. And we'll explain why it has brackets in it. Just know right now, there is an equivalent. It just looks a little different. ng-click, we have that in Angular 1. In Angular 2, we get rid of the ng and we just say click, and we have parentheses around it. And the parentheses signify that this is a event handler, essentially. So we're going to pass a function over, and that's what we're going to have execute when somebody clicks. We have ng-if, and now we have asterisk ng-if with no dash and a capital R. Again, you might wonder, what are they doing here? Why did things change? And it turns out this is considered, I believe it's called a structural directive, and apparently the asterisk, because I wondered why, it apparently helps the Angular 2's template compiler see individual attributes and nodes that it needs to manipulate. So apparently they did some tests where they didn't have the asterisk on there, and it was like 10 times slower. Their template compiler was like 10 times slower. Apparently they figured out that was, multiply that by all the components and stuff you're gonna have on the page, that made a huge difference. And so that's what they decided to go with this asterisk to let their template compiler know, hey, this is a section. This is a set of nodes that may get added. And so kind of interesting. We'll learn more about those two in a little bit. Now there's a few more. My slide updates. So we have ng model. We still have ng model in Angular 2, but it's a little different. There's brackets and parentheses here. And we're going to go in a little more detail on this one later. But for now, you can enjoy the fact that it's called bananas in boxes. We'll talk about why it is. We have ng repeat in Angular 1, and we have ng4 with, once again, the wonderful asterisk in front of it in Angular 2. Once again, signifying that the structure, the DOM, is going to change as a result of this attribute. Okay, one more after this. ng show, we just have the hidden attribute, and we have brackets around it. And we'll talk about what it is. So there's a way to do that. And then kind of a big one. In Angular 1, you had promises, right? You would go fetch some data, you would get back the promise. But in Angular 2, you have this thing called an observable, which is part of the whole reactive set of JavaScript, or just reactive programming principles in general. So you have this new set of terminology. Observables work a little different. We're going to talk about those a little bit later too. But if you want, in Angular 2, you can still use promises. So relax, because you can still use the promises if you want. And sometimes initially, when folks are new to Angular 2, and they're coming from Angular 1, it's a little easier to just use the promises that you're used to start out with. And there's a way to do that. They have a method all the time that you can use to get back a promise instead of an observable. And sometimes it's a little easier because you don't have to worry about it's this observable thing that has to work differently. So just use the promise as you're done. Okay, so that's the end of the Rosetta Stone section. Now we're back to learning about Angular 2 itself and learning about some of the different pieces that make up an Angular app. We're going to talk about components. We're going to talk about templates. We're going to talk about services. We're going to talk about dependency injection. And we're going to talk about metadata. Metadata. I think you'll find that much like this diagram, it all kind of works together and makes a little bit more structural sense than sometimes some of the Angular 1 stuff felt like it used to be. Less concepts, just more obvious. Okay, so how do we get started building an Angular 2 app? Well, it turns out that they have gone out and they have built a command line interface tool, Angular CLI. And it's a good thing we did this because there's something like 10,000 or some files if you add up all the NPM modules and the node modules that they download for an Angular app. Because they really leverage the module loader and they have a bunch of dependencies. You can install the Angular CLI tool using this npm command. And then you can use it, it's called ng, to create a new project. And that gives you a nice project skeleton, kind of set up with the best practices in Angular. It's very minimalistic. There's not like a big UI. It basically prints out hello world. And it sets up things like having a watcher that watches your TypeScript files and compiles them in the background for you. It sets up all your TypeScript compiler settings, that tsconfig file I showed a little earlier. It sets that up for you. It has a little built-in web server that will live reload as you're changing your code. It sets that all up for you. And it will allow you to generate some of the different Angular artifacts. So if you want to create a new component, if you want, you can say ng generate the name component and the name of your component, and it will actually create a TypeScript file with a few lines of code that kind of sets up for you. I tend to use this feature not very much because I find it's pretty easy to create a component on its own. But they have this concept of blueprints in the Angular CLI tool, which means you can create your own template of what you want a component to look like. Maybe your company has standards about what comments are in the file, how it's organized. You can create your own blueprint, and you can push that out to everybody. And every time they create a component with the CLI tool, they'll get your custom company template. The other nice thing that Angular CLI does is it sets up all the settings and infrastructure that you need to run unit tests. So you don't have to learn how to configure Karma or Jasmine or that stuff. It sets it up for you, and it even creates a really bare bones, simple test for whatever the base app component. So you can, out of the box, you can run, I think it's an ng test, and it'll fire up the test runner and it'll run any unit test that you've created. So that's great because I figure out how to set up Karma and stuff all the time. I've lost 2 days. before I got it working. So that's really nice. They also have end-to-end tests that they've set up too. And this is kind of neat because it's a really unique feature to Angular in general. They have this in Angular 1 as well, where you can run end-to-end tests with Protractor, and it fires up a WebDriver and a headless browser in the background. It runs your tests through Selenium. It knows about Angular things like waiting for some data to come back from the server and stuff. So it's pretty neat, and Angular CLI will configure Protractor and everything for you. So once again, you don't have to lose a day or two figuring out how to set it all up. And you end up with a command, I think it's like ng e2e that you run, and it'll execute all your end-to-end tests for you and show you the results. So it's kind of nice because it sets all this stuff up for you. And then you can, and it has a sample in there for you so you can just start writing your tests. Okay, so bootstrapping your app, quite a bit different in Angular 2 than Angular 1. You have let's say you have an index.html file, and you have a app component tag inside of that, which we'll talk about a little bit. But the different part is a little bit farther down. I think it's line 44 there in that script block there. We've got a system.import call there. And that's a library called system.js. And it serves as the module loader because the browsers out there don't yet support the ECMAScript 6 module loading specification. And Angular uses that heavily, TypeScript uses that heavily throughout. So we need this JavaScript library essentially serves as a polyfill to implement that module loading functionality. Again, the great thing is the Angular CLI sets up and creates this file for you and configures everything, so you really don't necessarily have to dive in super deep and learn all the details of system.js. But what it does allow you to do is use things like the import keyword in your code, in TypeScript code. And in theory, that allows the module loader to go out on demand, fetch different pieces of your code base, so that if you wanted to, you could set things up in kind of more of a lazy loading fashion. This is one area where I don't think the Angular 2 team or even some of the tooling vendors have quite finished this part of it. So most people seem to be bundling all of their modules, all of their files, into one or two JavaScript files and delivering that as a bundle, which we'll talk about later. And the Angular CLI tool, they've been updating their tool as that has been. So they actually have a production build command that will take all of your JavaScript files and concatenate them into one file and minifies them too, and it puts them into what's called a JavaScript file. So pretty efficient when you download just that. I think module loading and how you break up your files is probably going to evolve over time as the browsers get better. Also, the HTTP2 spec. So anyway, module loading, not very exciting, very boring. Really wishing that the browser should do it. But it doesn't right now. So that's and your bundles can be made with things like Webpack if you've used that, or there's some other module bundlers out there that Angular CLI sets them up for you. Takes care of it. I guess they're switching to Webpack. They don't use Webpack yet, but they're next version. So, but in the main.ts file, there you can see there's some import statements, but the real key is line 10 there. We have that call to bootstrap. And that's literally just a function that we're importing from the Angular library itself. And that's going to take care of starting up our app. And we pass it in a root component. In this case, standard is usually to call it app component. We're going to see what that file looks like in a little bit. So you pass in, here's my root component. And we're going to see in a moment there's some routing configuration. We'll also pass in to that bootstrap. We'll dive into that a bit. And then just in case we catch errors in case so that's bootstrap. So no more ng app. Instead, we have a little bit more in the main.ts file. Okay, so we've already, I've probably said the word component like 50 times already. So we better get in there and figure out what a component is. But before we do that, that lab that I built, because I want you visually to see what's in the UI that I'm building, and then we're going to map that back to the different components that we make. Because an Angular component is really any visual widget that you see on the screen. That's one way to define it. So let's quick do that demo. There we go. Okay. So we have pretend we're doing a fantasy football draft, and for those who don't play fantasy football, basically what you do is you can see all of the offensive players in the NFL, and you can pick who you want on your team that's going to score you the most points. So the goal is to draft people on your team that score a lot of points. And so we have different components on the screen in this draft system. We can see who's up, what the draft order is, who's going to draft first. And then we can see over here who all the players are in the system, and we can filter by last name. So we can type in a few letters, and it automatically filters that table of players for us. And then up here at the top, we have a little navigation bar, and we can jump over to a screen that shows us all the teams who are participating in our fantasy football league. And you can go back to the players list, and you can jump back, as you can see that we're going to different parts. And that's as far as I got on this side. That's all it does for now. But we wanted to keep it nice. So, with that in mind, we're going to go back in here. And we're going to take a look at what this means for Angular components. And it turns out you kind of have this hierarchy of components. So we have our app component. You can think of that as kind of taking up the whole screen. And then inside the app component, we have a nav bar component that was that black bar at the top of the screen. And then we have this giant green area that makes up pretty much the rest of the screen. And inside that green area, we have either the draft component, that was that screen that had all the players on the table, draft, or we have the fantasy teams component. That was a table of just all the fantasy teams. And they all sit inside the app component, underneath the app. So you can have child components that have a parent. You can have components that have children underneath them. And you can communicate between children and parents. Now, much like Angular 1 controllers, a component in Angular 2 can have a HTML template associated with it. So there's kind of a similarity between the two right there. And the components can talk to each other using calls to services, Angular services. They're very similar between Angular 1 and 2. So much like we have two controllers, share some data or functionality with the service, same thing in Angular 2. So now, what does one of these components actually look like? We've probably been talking about them for 5 or 10 minutes and haven't even shown the code for it. Let's see something. So a component is a TypeScript class. That's really all that is. The class itself is at the top of the screen. And components can have an HTML template, so that's the bottom half of this slide, is the HTML template. And in this case, that template file is called navbar.component.html. You can name it however you want. This is just kind of their out-of-the-box standard. And there's a set of metadata for the component, starting on line 5 there. I hope the folks way off to the side can see. If not, I'll post the slide so you can look at it. And there's this component attribute, some languages call it. Some languages call it an annotation. But it's basically a little piece of metadata where you're telling the Angular library some meta information about your component. And the first thing that we tell Angular about is this thing called the module ID. And we don't need to get into what that is. But suffice to say, it allows us to use relative paths. So like our template is in the same directory as our component TypeScript file. We don't have to give it like the full path all the way down to the HTML file. We can just say, here's the file name, assume it's in the same directory as the TypeScript file. So we have a selector with the component, and that is the name of the HTML tag in a template that you want this component to represent. So it turns out in our app component HTML file, which we'll see a little later, we actually have the navbar tag in there to signify that's where we want this component. We have a template URL. That's just the name of the HTML file. You can also, if you want, you can put your template in line right here in the TypeScript file as a string. Personally, prefer not to do that, especially if it's a template that's more than 1 or 2 lines long. But you can do it. And some of the IDEs out there will even give you all the fancy syntax highlighting, even if you do it in line. I don't care to use it myself when it makes things more easy. Yeah, if you had a simple template that was like 1 line, that would make sense. Then there's this element called directives. And you might remember, Angular 1 folks might remember directives. They're still, but they're a little different now, and they're much more de-emphasized. You don't really end up writing a directive per se, writing a component that's considered major. So, what this directives parameter here is for is any custom components that we're going to use inside this component, this navbar component, we need to tell Angular about here in this directives array. And in our case, we're going to use some router directives so that we can link up the different routes to the nav. And the Angular folks have provided this thing in uppercase called router_directives, which is called the barrel. It's right in the barrel here. And we'll explain a little bit more about a barrel and why they did that. But just think of it as like a handy shortcut for implementing a bunch of directives related to routing. And so we have that defined there. Then we have our class, which really couldn't be much simpler. We have a constructor which takes in a location object. And it turns out this is the location service that the Angular framework provides so that you can interact with the URL at the top. And we simply use that in a highlight method to determine what the current route is. So we can highlight that item in the template. Set a class that's active so we're adding information. And that's all there is to the TypeScript part of the component. So down below is our HTML template for the component. And most of that is really just code about the template itself. And we're going to dive into this template a little later when we talk about routing. So I'm not going to spend much more time later. I think I forgot to mention that that location service gets automatically dependency injected for us by Angular. So we can inject any services we want in there, including classes that we need. We'll see an example of that. That's almost exactly what we do. So there's some. Okay, components have a lifestyle. So they have different points in time as they're getting initialized that you can plug into and do your own custom logic. And I've just listed 5 of the most common ones on this slide. It turns out there's more. And you can read the Angular documentation and read about them. The Angular 2 has actually great documentation right from the start. They do a pretty good job of back in the beta phases and talking about parts of it. So it's actually really is a good reference to don't skip it. And the one that I use the most is that one is the one that fires every time the component is essentially initialized and is ready to essentially accept data. It's called the on changes after the on change. actually the only one I've had to use so far. Granted, I haven't used it a lot, but that's really cool. Oh, and as we're going to see, the component lifecycle is driven by which interface, TypeScript interface. So we have this implements keyword up here, and that's how you tell TypeScript that you're going to implement a certain interface. And in this case, we're saying that our component class here, this component, implements on and in that interface. And that interface requires that we have a method called ng on and in. And that's where we get to do the logic that we want to have happen when the component gets initialized. Basically, that's going to fire off that method when this component is initialized and ready to be displayed out. It's a great place to load in data. That's where I use it. So fetch data or graph data from the service class. That's what you use ng on. And we'll talk about why there's that weird call there to .subscribe. So that's an example of implementing a lifecycle method. So we have the constructor that does fire at an earlier point in the lifecycle, and then we have ng on it that fires. So most of the logic you're going to replace. Components themselves can take input into them, and they also, we're going to see in a second, can essentially output data as well, meaning they can broadcast events that alert other components that data has changed or a particular action has occurred. So when you want a component to take in some input, you use the name of the component, draft-order in this case, and then you use the bracket template syntax to indicate that we're going to pass some data, we're going to really bind some data into the component. So in this case, we're taking an array of fantasy football teams, and we're passing that into the draft order component. So that teams is actually a variable in our draft component TypeScript file that has some data. We're going to pass that to the draft order component. Draft order component's a little bit lower down the screen. And that takes in that teams attribute as a public field in the class. So that's where that second red arrow is set. So Angular's automatically going to do that for us. It's going to send that array on over to the draft order components. And you can see it doesn't really do anything else. It turns out it has a template that just looks through all those teams. So in this case, you can manipulate them. It just takes them as and this is kind of the whole philosophy around limiting the number of watches that you have in your Angular app. And Angular 2 is a lot more efficient and can display a lot more on the screen because it tries to minimize the number of places that it has to constantly update DOM nodes and as the digest cycle kind of happens in the background. And this is kind of one of the ways that it does this by not having a lot of cases where there's a lot of two-way data. It really encourages some of the one-way data from top level components down to the children. So you can architect it any way you want, but that's kind of the recommended approach that they show. Now I mentioned that components can output things as well, and usually what they output are events. They broadcast to use the Angular pointer specific events that other components can listen to. And the way that you do that in the code is in when you want to subscribe to a particular event, you use the parentheses syntax. So in this case, I'm trying to subscribe to the key up event that happens on that input tag. This is for the last name filtering. And so every time somebody releases a key, I want the filter changed method on my component to get called. And we can see that filter changed method a little bit lower on the screen there. That's on line 16 there. And it just takes an event in as an argument, and then it calls changed, the output the event emitter called changed that my component is exposing. So it emits an event from the player filter component to the player list component, basically saying, hey, the player filter changed. Here are the new values to the different filter components. That's essentially what it's and then you can see the player filter component itself. That's what is at the top of the screen here. It's exporting that changed event because it's emitting that changed event every time somebody presses a key. And it's going to call the player filter changed method on our player list component. And you can see that on line 24 there. And that method actually goes through my giant list of players and filters them down by their last name. So that's kind of where all the work filter is actually happening. It's in this completely separate player list. So you can imagine you've got a lot of different ways that you can structure your apps. It's almost more like building a desktop app. Another thing that you want to note is on line 9, you can see how I'm referencing the player filter component in the directives part of that attribute. And basically I'm telling Angular that somewhere in the player list component, I'm going to be using a player filter component. So it's kind of linking two components together. So if you forget to do that, it just won't do anything with the player filter tag. What's going on? It's not showing anything. Dependency injection in Angular 2 is very, very similar to Angular 1. The one big difference, or maybe it's just better features, is dependency injection is hierarchical. So just like you can have components that have a hierarchy, you can think of each component as its own dependency injector. And if it doesn't find what it's looking for in its dependency injector, it goes up to its parent and grabs it from there. So what this really means, and the only thing you have to worry about, is I recommend if you have services that are shared across a bunch of components, just define them, just specify them on the top level components that you're going to be using. So in many cases, that might be your run app component. Sometimes it might be maybe one step below that. In my case, I have an app component, and I want to put all my custom services, attach them there right at the app component level, which then makes them available to all the other child components. So you can see that on line 13 up there. That's what a provider is. It's just a service that you're going to provide to any other child. Just at the top level.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So this question was, if you have services that you're referencing from the child components, right? Do you have to configure their provider in every component that you reference that service for? And the answer is no. You only have to reference it on your top level component. So remember, we had the app component was at our top, and we had a bunch of child components underneath that. I only have to define my fancy team service as an example at my top level app component, and I can use it in any of my child components without doing anything else. And that was a great question because it summed up the whole slide. It's like I planned it or something. Can you come to my presentation at Midwest JS? Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
Alternatively, though, if you don't define it here, you would have to do that.
That's right. So if you don't define your services at the app component level, then you need to define them in that providers array in your child components. And this gives you the flexibility as a developer to structure your components and how your services reference them, kind of however you want. So you can either take advantage of the hierarchy, or you can say, you know what, that service is really specific to that component. I don't want it in there. And just like Angular 1, any of these services that get initialized as providers, services, but They're singletons, so they just exist in memory once, not a separate copy for every single component. Unless you only define them on the component level, then you're going to get one instance for each of those components. And I'd right now be So just define your dependencies at the topmost level that you possibly can. Yes. Yep. And down below, so the template down below, I'm just showing how my app component inside of its template, it has that nav bar component that we saw earlier, and then it has that router outlet, which basically means, or I'll show the router's configured in a moment, but it's that big green area. It's everything in the body goes in that router. So, speaking of routing, let's cover that next. This is the area of Angular 2 that I've noticed the most change over Angular 2's development cycle. And I think that they completely rewrote it. So they created this new router that was all the rage in Angular 2, and then they, I don't want to say they threw it away, but they kind of completely rewrote it in the last 6 months, I think. And hopefully they've kept a lot of people that just changed the API. I don't know what that changed. Okay, let's do a quick, because it's been a little while since we did the demo, so we might have forgotten. You're like me, you've completely forgotten how to draft demos. So let's see that again. So we had this nav bar up here, and it turns out that when you click on these different buttons, and this might be really hard to see, but the URL is changing up here. So a different route is getting called every time I click on it. And we have the main route, if you will, just has nothing on it, just like slash route. And then we have the teams route, and it says slash teams up there. So we have 2 routes in the app, that's it. So it couldn't get much simpler. So there's a couple parts to setting up routing. First is you need some place to define the routes themselves. And at the moment, the best practice seems to be to create this file in the root of your app called app.routes.ts. And inside of it, you basically create a constant with the type router.config. And what's great, by the way, about TypeScript is when you put these types in, if you're using an IDE, WebStorm, IntelliJ, Visual Studio Code, you get code hinting and code completion. So it actually tells you what methods are available, what arguments they take, which is fantastic. Especially when you're learning something new like Angular, you have no idea how to define a route. Kind of helps if it's oh, path, that's right. So it gives you code hinting if you put those types in, which is really helpful. So path is the actual string that's going to go on the URL to that route. And then you can say whether or not it's terminal. I'm not sure why they chose that word exactly, but terminal means is it the root. And then you define what components you want to have control that route, essentially. So we have a path that has nothing, set terminal true. It's okay, it's just a slash essentially. And we want the draft component to happen right that route. And then if we have teams on the end of the URL, then we want our fantasy teams component to control what's on the screen. And so depending on what route we're on, that's the component that's going to govern the area of the screen where we had that router outlet in our template. This is kind of like engine view was in Angular. And then at the bottom of your route definition file, you export a constant called so whatever you want. Best practice seems to be like app_router providers. So what you're basically saying here is this file is providing, just kind of like a service, a constant that represents the route configuration for your app. And the router has all kinds of cool in-depth features in it. You can have child routes. You can have apps that have whole routing trees underneath them, so you can break things up into modules. So this is a very simple example, but it's really an industrial strength route. And I'm only scratching the surface here. I'm trying to keep it simple so we can get started. And we call this provide router method that Angular gives us to load in that route. And we pass it in the app routes, which is kind of concept. And that all gets wrapped up in this concept. And, yep.
Question. I know that the Angular 2 router has gone through a couple of different iterations. They've gone through a couple of different build-outs. Has the syntax changed as they've gone through those build-outs, or has it been quite a bit from each different iteration?
Yes.
Is it in a state now where it's fairly, the concrete's fairly dry?
Yes.
So we can be fairly confident that.
I believe it's now, they say the router's in the release candidate stage, which if it's a release candidate like the other framework, might be working, but it's basically like a beta. But they actually did betas of the router already. So I think we're over the hump now on the router API. I think it's safe to start diving in there and learning about it because I don't think we're going to make big changes. So that was a great question. This is the single biggest area that I've seen change in Angular since I've been watching it. I've been following it since probably the first beta, which is like an alpha. That's telling us before the presentation. Betas were alphas. They're alphas. I don't know. Good quality. They just kept changing the APIs and so we're making the same exact apps and keep updating. And I'm going to show. I didn't put this on the slide, but I think it's worth noting because I got tripped up by it. You actually want to use the base tag in HTML. I probably have heard of the base tag. I had heard of it, but it was like 1990. So that it turns out there's this base tag that kind of defines how relative URLs work. And you actually want to use the base tag in your Angular 2 app. You want to put that in there. The Angular CLI has it in there, so just use the template. You're good. But if you miss that or mess it up, you can throw off the route. You must use that base tag to figure out how to parse the URL in the browser. So watch out for that. So linking to a route. So we've got our routes defined. Now we want to actually put a link on the screen to take us from one route to the other. And so we do that in our navbar HTML template. And we have the link to the players route, which happens to be just slash in the browser. And then we have a link to the teams route, which happens to be slash teams. And so you use the square brackets. Router link is the name of the directive that'll construct that link for us, essentially. So now when we click on players or teams, it takes us to the right place. And then, using that bracket notation again, we can control which class is set on each list item tag. So what we're saying there, it's kind of like using ng class. We're saying set the active class if the highlight method returns true. That's what that syntax means. And the brackets means that, let's see that in a second, the brackets kind of signify that we're binding, we want the DOM to change when that expression changes. And so that's all there is to it. We can link to a route. This has also changed, by the way, since the betas. Actually, linking to a route even has changed. It used to be you had betas for routes. Shouldn't go too far in that because it's not there. All right, services. The good news here is services haven't changed much between 1 and 2. And even better than that, all a service is a TypeScript class. Just a plain old TypeScript class. There's one special thing about it that's, I guess, Angular specific, and that's up there on line 7. There is an injectable attribute. Annotation, that's what the John Phillips one should use that. Injectable annotation. little piece of metadata to let Angular know that this is a service that may need to get injected into it. The rest is just like you would write any old class or any old TypeScript class. You can have fields, you can have methods, you can have a constructor. You can have your constructor take other services as arguments, and those will get injected automatically by Angular for you. So in this case here, I'm grabbing Angular's HTTP service and a log service that I created myself. And those will get injected automatically when this service is initialized. And I think we already had a question about it. The services are simpletons. Spun up one instance of them. And then I can go through and build a bunch of methods. And this is where one of the newer, maybe harder parts of Angular comes in. So you don't have to use this new thing called observables in Angular 2, but most of the examples out there seem to use it. You can convert an observable to a promise. But that's the way that in Angular 2, you essentially send data through the frame. So let me explain what that is. So observable is part of this reactive programming kind of trend. And reactive sounds like this fancy word. It's sometimes abbreviated RX. And I get confused. There's RxJS and there's reactive. Anyway, they're following this reactive pattern. And observable is one of those concepts in reactive programming. It basically means that instead of your data coming, think of it as coming in like one big chunk that just like populates an array. It's something is streaming data to you kind of constantly. That's kind of the concept around it. So when you make an HTTP request and you process that data, the idea is instead of just getting back one big array and then passing it, let's say, to an Angular component, you're instead telling that Angular component, I'm an observable and I'm going to start sending you some data at some point. And in fact, I may continue to send you data repeatedly, constantly over time. And the best analogy there is, what if your data were all WebSockets, where you would constantly be getting data fed in from servers, let's say more chat messages or post data or log entries. That's what an observable is. It's a way to think about how you're getting data in a very event-based way. There are some advantages with this approach because they built into the observable API the ability to cancel them, the ability to subscribe to them, the ability to just subscribe to them once and then kind of ignore them after that. They have more powerful concepts associated with the observables. Of course, with more power comes more complexity, I think. So there's wrapping your head around the concept of observables, and then you also have to learn this kind of new terminology about it. So I kind of have mixed feelings about it. They're very powerful, and you can do more sophisticated things with it than you can with promises. But who here's ever tried to cancel a promise or a set of promises? It's kind of tricky. You can't really cancel it. With observable, you can't. So that's one advantage I can tell you. And the other advantage, I think, comes down to the efficiency. Because data is like a stream of events, the Angular framework can listen to that stream of events, and when there are no events happening, it doesn't have to do any work. So that's kind of advantageous and allows it to be able to handle more data in the stream, because it's not constantly having to check every piece of data to see what's durable, what's changing. So the code to work with and make an HTTP request and suck the data in as observable, you can kind of see some of it in this example. I think you can see there's a bit more to it than typical promise. The good news is you can, if you want, just change, I guess it would probably be probably right after line 30 there. I think after you map the response of the data, you can just say, convert this to a promise, and then leave out the rest of the code after that. What I'm doing here that makes this a little bit more complicated than even your average working with observables is I'm caching the data. So I'm ensuring that I only go fetch the list of fantasy teams from the server once. And I stick it in, I store it inside the service. So It's only going to ever make one server request. Even if 10 components are asking for the list of fantasy teams, it's only going to make one HTTP request. And it's going to store that data. Yep. So this question was on line 30. I have a response argument there that's getting passed to map, and it has type response in it. And you're right, response is a class that Angular provides. Angular HTTP library provides. So I have methods that I can call response. In this case, I'm calling it JSON. So I'm basically saying treat the response that you just got back from the server as a JSON packet. Excellent. Huge advantage to TypeScript here. I didn't know what methods I could call and observable. I didn't know what was in a response. But because I was doing TypeScript and I had a nice IDE, I continued to use IntelliJ web service. I got nice code hinting right in the IDE. And I can call it JSON. That's what I want. So it gave me some nice hinting along the way. It wasn't like I just had to type a bunch of extra characters to get the response type. I got some benefit. The compiler is running too, the TypeScript compiler is running. So if you use the types and you call a method that doesn't exist, it's going to let you know right away. Versus having to wait to go into the browser and get your error console methods. Such my everybody's favorite console is one thing I got tripped up by this: when you're creating a service class, make sure that you put export in front of it. You can see that on line 8. If you don't export the class, it means that it's essentially private to that package. And since your Angular code is essentially outside of this class, it's not going to be able to find the class at all. So generally, I just always export my classes unless they're really truly class that I'm exposed to. I'll have some links in at the end of the presentation to learn more about observables. It's probably a 1 to 2 hour presentation in itself that I'm definitely not qualified to do. So that'll be, you can read the blog post and read a little bit more about some of the terminology. I think you'll find once you play around with them, they're not that bad. But it definitely was a bit intimidating when I was first writing. Okay, let's go to something a bit easier now. Template syntax. We've got one-way data binding, not one-way data binding. Just like Angular 2 has same kind of syntax where you've got the curly brackets, 2 of them. What do you call that? Handlebars or mustache or something. Anyway, you got 2 of those guys, and then you've got your variable that you want to bind to. And so by default, everything in Angular 2 is a one-way data binding, which means that data will get put into that variable once when the template's initially initialized, and after that, but there's a way to do 2-way data binding over the same moment. Turns out, most of the time, you just want to do 1-way data binding, so it's really not too big of a deal. We got the event binding. We've already seen a bunch of examples of this. That's where that parenthesis syntax comes in. Anytime you see that in a template with parenthesis, that means you are telling Angular, I want to bind to a specific event. So in this example, we're binding to the click event, specifically telling it to execute the handle click method. So we have 2-way data binding, and this is my favorite slide because there are bananas in a box. How cool is that? That is the only way I can remember this thing. That has square brackets, parentheses, the name of the thing that you want a 2-way data bind, and then a parenthesis and a square bracket. And sure enough, it looks like 2 of them in the box. Figure this out. So Ben Dindell, by the way, has a great blog. He's got lots of great Angular 2 articles, and he made this graphic. So it's great. And if you ever get a chance to, he lives in New York, but he sometimes is at conferences. If you could choose to talk to him, he's a fun guy to talk to. So banana in a box syntax, 2-way data binding. So ng model is a good example. When you have a form and you have a value inside an input. And as you're changing the value in the input, you want that value to update dynamically, let's say somewhere else on the screen. That's a great way, that's something you want to do with two-way data, essentially. Likewise, if you want to update the data model, you want to do two-way data. So if you change the variable, you want that to update inside the input elements. If you make changes in the input element, you want that to go in there. That's two-way data. In fact, I can't think of too many other places I've used this other than in forms themselves. That's where it comes in. That's why Angular is so efficient, because it limits two-way data binding to only until. So here's a little bit more real-world example. There's actually an input text box. Box syntax and player.name. Whenever that changes, either in the input text box or in player.name variable. So this other thing we've been seeing a lot, the square brackets, right, and setting some kind of property on the HTML element. Turns out this thing's called DOM binding. That's what they call it. And once we start data binding, we're no longer working with HTML attributes. We aren't setting attributes, but we're setting properties on the DOM elements themselves via these components and these directives that we're creating. So all you can think of it is just, hey, I'm setting the disabled property on button DOM. That's essentially what this is saying. That's the way to think about it. And this took, by Angular 2 doing this, it took out a whole ton of custom directives that they used to have that essentially used to do this very same thing. And I think they could do this because they can leverage the newer browsers that have support for that built in. They didn't have to do a bunch of hacks to make sure disabled worked in Then we have the structural directives, everybody's favorite thing with an asterisk. So we have asterisk ng4, which is telling the Angular template compiler, hey, you're going to be messing with some DOM elements in here, so pay attention. And here, this is how you move through an array of fantasy teams in this case. We use ng4 and use this little thing, like a keyword. And say, okay, for every team in my team's array, I want you to loop through this DOM element. And then inside that loop, you can refer to team as the individual item. I think there's also an index you can get passed into, so you know which element you're in the array. Index. And you can also do things like track by, which somebody folks are that. You can still do track by, that information statement.
Good. Yep. So how does Angular 2 play with Angular 1? For example, if I have ng4 in one element, and then I go and do an ng repeat in another element with an Angular 1, how's that going to work?
So the question is, how does Angular 2 work with Angular 1? And how can you mix and match your template syntax?
Sure.
Great question. So amazingly enough, the Angular team, they've actually created a library or a shim, I don't know the best way to describe it, but they've created a way that you can create apps that are partly built in Angular 1 and partly built in Angular 2. But by partly, I mean that you're going to have a component that's built in Angular 2 that's going to live in Angular 2 land. And you're going to potentially have an Angular 1 component, because you can do this now in Angular 1.5, or you can have an Angular 1.5, or any version of Angular controller. And it can exist over here in Angular 1 land. And the two can exchange data and events, and they can work together in a larger app. But I don't think that there's a way to mix like an Angular 2 component and Angular 1 template, let's say. I think you've got to break things down into components and functional areas of the app and kind of convert them in an incremental fashion. And luckily, the two, Angular 1 and Angular 2, can exist side by side. So ng upgrade is the name of the library. That's it. Do a quick Google search on it. There's some examples. Other structural directives that I haven't shown examples of are like ngif. About that one. There's an ng switch as well. So that you can use those constructors. All right, here are some resources that you can use to learn a little bit more about Angular 2. Angular.io is the website for Angular 2. Actually, really well done. A lot of good documentation up there. They keep it up to date. Well up to date. There's the Angular 2 style guide that John Papa continues to maintain. Is the awesome Angular 1 style guide too. This time the style guide is actually on the Angular 2 site. It's official. So that's a good starting place. Constantly evolving. They're adding more things to it all the time. The starter app that I learned the most, kind of a simple sample app that I learned the most from, was Dan Norman's starter app. Angular 2 Jumpstart. Learned a lot from that. John Papa has an Angular 2 course. It's a few months old now. Say it's dated, but there are things like the router has been changed since his course, so you will learn a ton from the course. It's still beneficial, but there are a few areas that have changed since his course. So if you have a website subscription, check that out. And then there is NG Book 2. There's NG Book 1 for Angular 1, which is a fantastic book and online example. And they've got one for Angular 2, so it's a book I've been good. So with that, I don't know if folks have any more questions. If you go out to the GitHub link up here, you can actually download the whole sample app and maybe do a fantasy football draft. Cool. Okay. Well, thank you. Oh, we got a question.
My question
So the question was, now that Angular 2 has components, what does that do with the old controller as syntax and scope? Great question. So now we have components in Angular 2, which are a TypeScript class. So it's kind of like if you were using controller as in Angular 1, and you were always referencing, let's say, VM as your controller as, you're always referencing stuff inside VM. That's what your Angular 2 component acts as. So if you've been using controller as, you have a huge head start, because that's basically what you're doing. You just don't have to say controller as. You just have to. Yes, they're the, like div. Okay. So the question was, what happens if you have the selector for a component be the same name as an existing HTML element, like div? I haven't tried it, but I think it'll work. I think every time you have div in your code, it will execute that component. I think it could actually be good. I don't think they're off limits. I don't think the standard HTML tag names are off limits. I've never tried that. To make your own custom P tag. I know, Blink, gotta implement Blink. Bring it back. Bring it back. Okay, are you good? Question? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So the question was, does the Angular CLI provide a way to do things based on environment? Like in the dev environment, you insert viewer on the hit versus production. And the CLI actually sets up by default an environment.ts file where you can put those different configurations in. And it might have been hard to see in the Bootstrap file. There, I had a little if statement at the top that said something like, if the environment is production, then turn off the essentially. So you can do stuff like that Bootstrap or inside your code to React. And yeah, the Angular CLI has that kind of built in right off the bat. Yeah, question.
Do you know if the NG Book 2 has the latest release has the updates to the router?
They were up to date. Last I looked at it was maybe like a month or two ago.
Okay.
I would check and see. They've been keeping pretty close to it. I just didn't know how close he is. I suspect that it's up to date. He's pretty good. It's it's been the, let's put it this way, it's been the most up-to-date resource that I know.
Okay.
Other than the Angular documentation, that's been the best one. It's stayed the closest. It's been the most accurate. All right. Well, thanks for sitting in this room that's getting hotter and hotter. We all survived. And maybe it's just me up here, but it's probably worse outside. So thank you.
Another round of applause for Kurt and that great presentation. Okay, so we will have our prize run. I'll go ahead and pull it up. We're going to have Sarah do the emceeing back there. Hopefully he's going to cooperate with me. We'll see
It's
what
on.
happens. Okay,
Try
ready
to
to
show
go?
it up here. Yep.
Still plugged in back there.
It's all plugged in.
Wait for it. Wait for it. There you go. Okay. So we're going to click on JetBrains real quick. It's 2 tabs for that. So we have 2 prizes to give away tonight. We have the options for a JetBrains subscription, so you can get a subscription for a year to any of their products. You can do it for all of them. I don't know how you're going to do all of that coding all in 1 year. But if you want to, you can go for it. One of the products that Kurt talked about, WebStorm, IntelliJ, both valid options for this. They make a lot of different stuff. Collaboration tools. Really, their sweet spot is IDEs, which are fancy text editors to make all your code that much easier. WebStorm's a great one, especially for JavaScript and other stuff. The other prize that we give away tonight, that we're actually doing 2 drawings for, is Front-End Masters. Front-End Masters is honestly one of the best learning resources for Angular, React, Ember, JavaScript, all of the things. Mark Gransky is the local guy that puts this on, but gets national talent coming from all over the place for all different sort of things. If you want to click on courses real quick right here. There are all types of stuff. There's both in-person and online courses that you can watch and participate in. I would suggest you on their mail list. They have tons of great workshops. Some of them are free to the community. And so as far as continuing education, Front-End Masters is one of the best. That's not because they're sponsored. So check them out. We'll be giving away their prizes tonight. So sir, you want to pull up Prizatron. So if you're not familiar with Prizatron, Dale Watts, one of our members, created this. It ties into the Meetup API. So if you RSVP'd for the event tonight, you can be picked as a prize winner or possibly shamed in front of a room of people. Not ideally what happens. So sir, go ahead and fire it up. Paul L. Paul L, are you here? Shame. Shame. Shame.
Probably was here. Try again.
Yep. Gail. Gail, are you here?
Shame.
Ben.
That's bad.
Ben, you are here. But do give me your email address. Would you like to choose the Front-End Masters year sub or the JetBrains year sub? Front-End Masters. Okay, so we got 1 Front-End Masters left and 1 JetBrains. Kyle. Come on, Kyle. I I know Constance. Mark. No, Mark's here. Mark, you're here. Front-end masters. All right, good choice. We have 2 front-end masters down and 1 JetBrains to go. Rita, would you like to accept the JetBrains year sub?
Do I have a choice of taking the front-end masters?
We already have 2 of those done, so I would say nay. Okay, we'll hand that out. So thank you for everybody for coming out tonight. If you want a prize, do come talk to me, and we will get those sent over to you ASAP. Thank you.
I go through until we hit jail.
Oh, you wrote them down. Thank you. I can do it.
There we go.
All right, everybody, watch out real quick. I got a picture of Dale. He didn't show up. Sweet, sweet Friday trying.
There you go. All right, I'm posting it.
All right.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. Let me take down your email address and I'll send you either way. What is your email address? N-A. I will send that over this evening, if not first thing tomorrow. And I'll find out, we may have.
If that's the one.
Okay, yeah, we should be able to do it. Mark's pretty good about getting those. Yep, no problem.
Is your shirt open source?
Yeah, 2015.
I didn't go, but I had a lot of coverage.
Yeah, that's sick. The one this year sounds sick too.
So Joel?
Yeah, I work at Prime Academy now. We have school on Thursdays with blood, so I could go. What is your email address, sir? LIPPSON. Cool. Did you know, as a guy who has his first middle last name is my email, you can take the dots out and everything's still works?
Really?
Try it today, it's going to change your life.
Yeah, that does change my life.
Yeah.
I got it.
Type Joel.T.Miller forever, and then one day somebody's going to Joel T. Miller flat. I don't know if they just condensed them down or what, but I feel like I tried just to scrape through like 2006 when I got the email. It wasn't available, and like all of a sudden, my email address is Joel T. Miller.
Yeah, I'll definitely try that.
Try it out. Yeah, I'll send you over your license that you got from
Yep.
Cool, I'll send it over, man.
Thank you.
No problem, man.
Oh, well, hi.
Peace out, YouTube.